Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's time for us to begin. Let's begin our class with a word of prayer. And Steve Walton, would you lead us in prayer, please, sir?
Sure. Heavenly Father, we thank you for allowing us to come here tonight for the purpose of learning more about you and about what your will is for us, from taking a small portion of your word, in particular 2 Samuel chapter 16 through 20. We ask to be with Brother Pope tonight. Help him to say those things that would be helpful and edifying and encouraging, and even at times perhaps even some things that we need to hear about how we need to be living our lives more in accordance with your will. And we ask that you help us to learn from the life of David, the mistakes that were made, the life that he lived, and the successes that he had. And help us to imitate the successes and to not imitate those things that failed. We ask you forgive us of our sins, forgive us of our shortcomings, forgive us of the times when we have not lived in accordance with your will. Watch over us and take care of us for this time, and watch over us and protect us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Turn to your Bibles, please, to the 13th chapter of the book of 2 Samuel. We got down to about verse 23 last time. You remember, because of David's sin with Bathsheba, the Lord had told him through Nathan the prophet in chapter 12 and verse 10, he said, "Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house." Here, this curse that was placed on David was one that we're going to see played out in spades today, because it is just absolute tragedy from this particular point on. You remember 2 weeks ago we saw how that David rose to power and that he was able to succeed in everything that he did because he loved the Lord and followed the Lord and did what the Lord would have him to do, and how the enemies that had plagued the children of Israel ever since the days of the judges had been basically put to the side. You'll notice in the map that I have up there, in all the areas that are orange and all the areas that are blue and all the areas that are green, David had been able to subdue his enemies and was able to cause peace to rule throughout the land. But because of his sin with Bathsheba, we see the Lord withdrawing his benefit from David, and he said, "The sword will never depart from your house." Now, sadly, some of the seeds of this had been planted quite early, because you remember in the very first class period that we had, we talked about how in Deuteronomy 17, there were several things that the kings that were going to exist among the children of Israel 400 years after Moses was speaking would be ones that ought not to do certain things. And one of the things that they said, they're not to multiply horses, they're not to multiply gold, they're not to multiply wives. Guess what David begins to do? He begins to multiply wives. And I think that part of that situation is one that creates the environment that's going to allow for there to be not much brotherly feeling among some of these descendants of David, as we're going to see played out today. We already saw last week with the rape of Tamar by Amnon, her brother, that things weren't handled like they should have been. That here you have a young man, because he's the heir to the throne, is someone who's probably handled much more delicately than he should have been. According to the Old Testament law, if someone raped someone, if it was a married lady or if it was a betrothed lady, they had to die. But in this case, we don't know particularly that she was betrothed. In that case, a marriage was an option for the rapist. He could choose to marry her, but he could never divorce her all of his days, because he had to forego the bride price, and he had to also make sure that he took care of her for the rest of her days under those circumstances. David didn't impose either of those things. because it was his family. Have you ever known anybody who, when sin came along and it was somebody else, it was terrible, but when it happened in their family, it wasn't that bad? You see, David is doing the same thing here, showing himself not to be all that he needs to be here in this situation. Yes, Rachel? Right. Right. There's a certain amount of order that develops in a family when you have one man and one woman for life and they have children. There is a common bond that exists between all of the ones involved in that. When you start having a situation where you have a man who basically just serves as the stallion for the brood mares, and they wind up having children, and those children have much more of an affinity with the mother than they do with the father, and the father is off fighting wars or doing whatever else he needs to do and paying attention to his wives and not ever getting to the point where he's not looking for another. Can you imagine, ladies, if you had a husband who was going to acquire several different wives? What that meant was he was always going to have a roving eye. But he wasn't having a roving eye for somebody that he wouldn't marry, but he's just having a roving eye looking for the next pretty girl to marry. And that's a terrible situation to exist. It's not what God had in mind from the very beginning. And sadly, we see David involved in that situation, and it keeps him from, just like you say with Adonijah later on, from disciplining him as he should have done. And we see that same problem with Amnon. We see the same problem with Absalom. We're going to see the problem with Adonijah, and it's going to be part of what leads to the sword never departing from his house. You remember when Tamar was, after her sexual assault, she went and stayed with her full brother, Absalom, and he took care of her, and he told her not to worry about it. And Absalom waited a full 2 years. And it tells us in the last part of chapter 13 that what he did was he had sheep shearers. This is in the spring of the year. They sheared the sheep in the spring when the wool had gotten thick on the sheep from the winter pasture up in the hills. It also corresponded with the grain harvest that they had that took place in the spring as well. So it was a festive time when you had your sheep shearers out there shearing sheep. You were also able to eat parched grain, which was nice. You didn't get that most of the time. You generally ground the grain into flour and made bread with it, but you didn't get to eat fresh parched grain. And this is a festive time for people. And he asked his dad to come out and be with him with his sheep shearers. And his dad says, "No, I can't do that." He says, "Well, listen, can you send Amnon out here?" And he says, "Well, why do you want Amnon out here?" And he says, "Why should he go with you?" And Absalom urged him. So David let Amnon go, and all the king's sons went with him. Perhaps David is having a little whiff of the fact that there may be something, afoot, and says, maybe if I send all the boys down there, it'll be okay. And certainly Absalom wouldn't have a problem with all the boys coming to share in the sheep shearing. Well, he does that, but Amnon gives an order to his servants and says, when I say strike Amnon, this is verse 28 of chapter 13, then put him to death. Do not fear, have I not myself commanded you? Be courageous and valiant. He's waited 2 whole years for this, thought it through completely, and yet planned this evil against him. When Amnon is struck down and killed by Absalom's servants, Absalom's brothers, they get all nervous about this and they start fleeing. And the word comes back to Jerusalem that all the king's boys have been killed. And that certainly wasn't right. In fact, Jonadab, it says in verse 32, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, responded, "Do not let my lord suppose that they put to death all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead, because by the intent of Absalom this has been determined since the day that he violated his sister Tamar." Can you think of anything peculiar about Jonadab being the one to mention this? You remember who gave the advice to Amnon about how he might be able to get close to his sister? It was Jonadab, his cousin. And here Jonadab, he's thrown Amnon under the bus. He's just saying that it's just Amnon that's killed. Don't worry about it. The rest of the boys are going to be okay. And when they finally come to Jerusalem, it says, verse 36, as soon as they'd finished speaking, behold, the king's sons came and lifted their voices and wept. And also the king and all his servants wept very bitterly. Now Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son every day. So Absalom had fled and gone to Geshur and was there for 3 years. And the heart of King David longed to go out to Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon since he was dead. Geshur is a kingdom that is right about there. It was an Aramaic kingdom that eventually is swallowed up by Aram as a whole. All of these are eventually going to be consolidated into the kingdom that later on is going to be a kingdom that vies with Israel and Judah as kind of the three kingdoms that jockey for power during the days of the divided kingdom. Geshur was the place where David had gotten Absalom's mother. So Talmai is his grandfather. So it's kind of a logical place for him to go. And it tells us that he goes there for 3 years. So it's been 2 years since the situation with Amnon and Tamar. It's now 3 years since Absalom had Amnon killed. And now you've got a situation to where King David is content, apparently, to let Absalom stay there until finally he gets over the fact that Amnon's dead and there's nothing I can do about it. In chapter 14, it tells us this. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, Scott.
We assume Absalom knows that he's probably safe there, not just because it's his grandfather, but probably because David has made some kind of peace treaty or something that was part of marrying that king's daughter. Usually it brought peace between the kingdoms, so he knows David's not going to attack him.
Right.
But I think the most condemning thing, and maybe I'm just reading this, I don't know if I'm reading it right or not, but verse 39, the way I almost read it, it says it's like he was comforted about Amnon. He was comforted that Amnon was dead. Mm-hmm. And to me, it almost seems like David is finally somebody's taking care of this blight of Amnon that I didn't have the guts to do it, but Absalom did, and he obviously loves Absalom, but he seems to be comforted. Not that he got over his death, but he seems to be comforted by the fact that he is dead.
You may be right.
Which is just because of the sin that he had committed.
Yeah, you may be right. It may be a situation in which, like you say, he's glad that the situation at least seems to be resolved. But he, for a time, doesn't allow Absalom to come back into the fold of the family either. In chapter 14, it tells us the story about a woman of Tekoa who is called upon by Joab to come to David with a story. She is an actress, apparently, and what she does is she acts out this story about the fact that she had 2 sons, she was a widow, and the 2 sons struggled with one another, and since there was no one there to separate them, one struck the other and killed him. Therefore, when the one who had survived everybody was mad at him and mad at his mother because she didn't turn him over to the rest of the family to slay him because he had killed his brother. So she explains this situation to David, and David sees the situation. So she says, if both of my sons are dead, there's no one to carry on my husband's name, and there's no one to take care of me. So it is a pitiful situation. I don't know that David is really acting like he should in terms of a judge of the law, but he does say, she says in verse 9, "O my lord the king, the iniquity is on me and on my father's house, but the king and his throne are guiltless." So the king says, "Whoever speaks to you, bring him to me, and he'll not touch you anymore." And then she said, "Please let the king remember the Lord your God, so that the avenger of blood will not continue to destroy. Otherwise they'll destroy my son." And he said, "As the Lord liveth, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground." So here again, I'm not so sure that's good interpretation of Old Testament law in terms of the avenger of blood, but it is a situation in which David at least has compassion for this widow in her situation. The woman then, I think, spills the beans a little bit in verse 13 when she says, "Why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in speaking the word, the king is as one who is guilty, in that the king does not bring back his banished one." So David finally gets the idea, and he explains to her how he's letting her off the hook. He finally says in verse 18, "The king answered and said to the woman, 'Please do not hide anything from me that I'm about to ask you.' And the woman said, 'Let my lord the king speak.' And the king said, 'Is the hand of Joab with you in all this?'" I think I see what's going on here. So he finally understands the situation and decides that on the basis of that, he'll recall Absalom to Jerusalem. And Joab, it says in verse 23, arose and went to Jeshurun and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. However, the king said, "Let him turn to his own house and let him not see my face." So Absalom turned to his own house and did not see the king's face. So it is a situation where, again, there's not complete reconciliation in spite of the fact that David has at least allowed him back to Jerusalem. And there's a good description in verse 25 of Absalom as it talks about him. It says, "Now in all Israel no one was as handsome as Absalom. So highly praised from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no defect in him. When he cut the hair of his head, and it was at the end of every year that he cut it." I guess he let his hair kind of grow long during the year. "And for it was heavy on him, so he cut it, and it weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels by the king's weight." That's a little shy of 5 pounds. 5 pounds of hair is a pretty good head of hair that you have on you. And it says every year when he did that, that's about how much it weighed. So Absalom there was born 3 sons and 1 daughter whose name was Tamar, and she was a woman of beautiful appearance. Now Absalom, this is again another 2 years that he lives without being completely reconciled to the king. And so he calls upon Joab, but Joab's not really taking his calls these days. And so he sends again for Joab, and Joab again doesn't take his calls. So this time he says in verse 30, "See, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." He knows how to get a response from Joab, I think. So Absalom's servants set the field on fire, and then Joab arose, came to Absalom at his house, and said, "Why have your servants set my field on fire?" And he says, "Behold, I sent for you, saying, 'Come here, that I may send you to the king,' to say, 'Why have I come from Jeshurun? It'd be better for me to still be there. Now therefore let me see the king's face, and if there is iniquity in me, let him put me to death.' So then Joab came to the king and told him, and he called for Absalom. Thus he came to the king and prostrated himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom." Here there is a sense of reconciliation that finally takes place between David and Absalom here in this situation. If that was the way it ended, that might be a little bit of an encouragement, but it's not. In chapter 15, it tells about the conspiracy that Absalom was involved in which he acquires a chariot. He acquires 50 men as runners before him. So when he comes through in his chariot, there are people saying, Absalom's coming, Absalom's coming. He used to rise early and stand beside the way, it says in verse 2, to the gate. And when any man had a suit to come to the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, From what city are you? And he'd say, Your servant's from one of the tribes of Israel. Then Absalom would say to him, See, your claims are good and right, but no man listens to you on the part of the king. Isn't it interesting? Everybody who came with a suit that they wanted the king to resolve, and of course the king's mighty busy, he just happens to be able to talk to him, and he says, Boy, if I was ruling, it'd be terrible that this injustice would get by. If I was ruling, then there wouldn't be this kind of situation. And Absalom would say, Oh, that one would appoint me judge in the land. Then every man who has any suit or cause could come to me, and I would give him justice. And when a man that came near to prostrate himself before him, he'd put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. That may not mean anything to you, but here when someone prostrates himself before the king or one of his sons, he doesn't allow him to continue to do that. He grabs him by the hand and shakes his hand. You can understand if someone was bowing to you and you grabbed them by the hand and you kissed them in the ancient Middle East, in fact in the current Middle East and in the Mediterranean region of the world, it's not odd to see men kiss one another. When I've gone to Italy to preach, I have been kissed by more men than ever in my whole life. And it always seems like in the congregations, that's one of the ways that they indeed follow through with what the Scriptures say. Greet one another with a holy kiss. That's the way you greet brothers and sisters in Christ. Of course, it always seemed to me that the brothers were much more interested in kissing me than the women were, but that's just the way it is. It's a sign of brotherly affection. And here, this is the kind of brotherly affection rather than the attitude of a despot that Absalom is showing toward these people. And it says in verse 6, In this manner Absalom dealt with all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole away the hearts of the men of Israel. In verse 7, there's a passage there in which there is a textual variant. I think most likely it should be after 4 years. Whereas in the New American Standard, it lists both of those. It says after 40 years that Absalom said to the king. David only rules for 40 years. I'm not sure Absalom is that age at this particular time. I think 4 is more likely after the event. So we've seen 2 since Amnon. We've seen 3 while he was in Jeshurun. We've seen 2 since he was able to be introduced back to the fold. And here we see a situation to where apparently 4 years later, after he has cultivated this relationship with the people of Israel, it says, Please let me go and pay my vow that I've vowed to the Lord in Hebron. Now Hebron's important. It's a Levitical city, but it is the most important city in the tribal area of Judah. And you remember who's from the tribe of Judah? David's from the tribe of Judah. And you remember when David became king, he was king in Judah first for 2 years before he became king of everything. He ruled in Hebron for 7 years before he captured the city of Jerusalem. So here he says, For your servant vowed a vow while I was living in Jeshurun in Aram, saying, If the Lord shall indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I'll serve the Lord. And the king said to him, Go in peace. So he arose and went into Hebron. But Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom is king in Hebron. Then 200 men went with Absalom from Jerusalem who were invited and went innocently, and they did not know anything. So apparently they weren't planning on a revolt, but they wind up being Absalom's retinue here. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city Gilo, while he was offering the sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. Finally, when Absalom is ruling in Hebron, but he begins, because of this work that he's done to cultivate dissent throughout all of the land, It says, a messenger came to David in verse 13, saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. And David said to all his servants who were with him in Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, for otherwise none of us will escape from Absalom. Go in haste, or he will overtake us quickly and bring down calamity on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. So David and his whole household leave, except for 10 concubines that he leaves in charge of the palace. And the king goes out with him, and it says they go and stop at the last house. And as the king passed on beside them, in verse 18, all the Kerethites and the Pelethites and the Gittites, now these are all Philistine mercenaries, 600 men who had come with him from Gath, passed on before the king. In verse 19, we see the incident where he talks to Ittai the Gittite. That's kind of, I love that name. I love it when, Gideon fights Midian and Ittai is a Gittite and all that stuff. But it basically just means he's from Gath. So he was a Philistine too. The king said to Ittai the Gittite, why will you go with us? Return and remain with the king, for you're a foreigner and also an exile. Return to your own place. You came only yesterday. That doesn't mean he came yesterday. It means you're a relatively newcomer here. And shall I make you wander with us while I go where I will? Return and go back to your brothers. Mercy and truth be with you. But Ittai answered the king and said, as the Lord lives and as my lord the king lives, surely wherever my lord the king may be, whether by life or by death, there also will your servant be. And so David said to Ittai, go and pass over. So Ittai the Gittite passed over with all his men and all the little ones who were with him. It says all the country was weeping, and David went about weeping as he crossed the brook Kidron. And you remember in this particular map, it shows the city of David portion. The top of this map is to the north and west. To the southeast of this map is the Mount of Olives, and between the city of David and the Mount of Olives, along that line that you see that goes from the bottom left of the page up to about the middle of the page on the far right, that's the Kidron Valley. There's a brook that's there that runs when the rainy season is in place. But he crosses the brook Kidron, and all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness. Zadok came, who's the priest, and Abiathar, who's also priest. They come up and wanted to go along with him, but he tells them, you go back and don't bring the Ark of the Covenant with me. He says, if I have no delight in you, behold, here I am. Let him do to me as seems good to me. If the Lord wants me gone, then there's no need to move the Ark of the Covenant. If the Lord wants me back, I'll come back and be with the Ark of the Covenant and be able to worship with you all. And that's what's done. He then tells them that what they need to do is to take their sons and allow them to be basically the spies that work out. Ahimaaz and Jonathan, who would serve as the spies. They were living down in Ain Rogel, which is just off to the bottom left corner of this particular map. And they would get word, and they would be able to get word eventually to David. It also happened that Hushai, the Archite, who was a friend of David's, David says, I want you to stay in Jerusalem. And you stay in Jerusalem and try to upset the advice of Ahithophel. Remember, Ahithophel had been David's counselor and had gone over to Absalom. Now, he says, I want you to act like you're going along with Absalom too. But what I want you to do is to overthrow the counsel of Ahithophel. And when you find out things that I need to know, you send word to them by Zadok and Abiathar. They'll send word to their sons. They'll get word back to me. So he came into the city just as Absalom comes into the city. So here Absalom now comes and is declared to be king by everybody in Jerusalem. As David is fleeing across from the city of Jerusalem, this map is too small to be able to show it to you very well, but Jerusalem is not but say 30 or 40 miles from the Jordan River, and he's fleeing east of the Jordan. So that's what David is trying to do here in this situation. And as he goes, he runs into a servant of Mephibosheth. Now, who is Mephibosheth? Do you remember? Jonathan's son, Saul's grandson. So, and you remember anything particularly about Mephibosheth? Right, he was lame in his feet. So here he wasn't able to go, and he had been given all the property that belonged to Saul's line. Now Ziba, his servant, comes out to meet David and brings, it says, a couple of saddle donkeys, 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, 100 summer fruits, and a jug of wine. And he comes to help David in this situation. When David asked, "Where's your master's son?" Ziba said to the king, "Behold, he's staying in Jerusalem, for he said, 'Today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me,'" which seems to be a lie. And so the king said to Ziba, "Behold, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours." And Ziba said, "I prostrate myself. Let me find favor in your sight, O my lord the king." So Ziba comes out, and he is faithful to David, but he's not faithful to his master, Mephibosheth. Another person, Shimei, who is of the tribe of Benjamin, meets David on his way to the Jordan River. And it says in verse 6, he threw stones at David and to all the servants of King David and all the people and all the weighty men who were at his right hand and his left. And Shimei said that when he cursed, get out, you man of bloodshed and worthless fellow. The Lord has returned upon you all the bloodshed of the house of Saul, in whose place you've reigned, and the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom, and behold, you are taken in your own evil, for you're a man of bloodshed. Then Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, you remember Joab's brother, says, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over now and cut off his head." You remember? Why did you cut off heads in those days? You remember? It's proof. It's better than a death certificate. Because here, he's, let me cut his head off. I'll be absolutely satisfied he's a dead man under those circumstances. But the king said, and I like this with David, "What have I to do with you, O sons of Zeruiah? If he curses, and if the Lord's told him, curse David, then who shall say, why have you done so?" Then David said to Abishai and all his servants, "Behold, my son who came out from me seeks my life. How much more now this Benjamite? Let him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him." I've got worse problems than the fact that this Benjamite decides he wants to cuss me. So let's just leave him alone. And so they wind up leaving him alone. And Absalom winds up entering into Jerusalem and taking over the city, which is the capital of all Israel, as the king of Israel, albeit temporarily. When Absalom comes to Jerusalem, he comes in to meets Hushai, and Hushai goes along with what David had said earlier. He shows himself to be, presents himself as a traitor to David, but as someone who will be a loyal counselor to Absalom. And he says in verse 19 of chapter 16, "Should I not serve in the presence of his son as I have served in your father's presence? I will be in your presence." So here Absalom says, okay, Ahithophel, what should I do? I'm in Jerusalem. David's fleeing to cross the Jordan River. What should I do? Should I try to go to the fords of the Jordan and block his retreat with the men now that I have all Israel on my side, or not? Ahithophel says you need to get after it as quick as you can, and you need to try to attack. But he also gives some advice that's important, that is going to be especially heinous. He says there's a lot of people who are hesitant to go along with this revolt because they're afraid that David and Absalom will make peace with one another. After all, they're father and son. But what do you think is going to happen to those that revolted against David that aren't his kinfolks? You need to go in to the tent, put a tent up on the palace roof, and have all 10 concubines in there, and you need to go into them. So here the idea is you go in and you sexually defile these concubines, and that way you'll make yourself so odious to David in the eyes of everyone that they'll realize peace can't be established ever again. And so he gives that advice. Now, remember, he's also given advice that 12,000 men need to be sent out to guard the fords of the Jordan and to be able to beat David's men there and to be able to fight them and defeat them before they get across the Jordan. Hushai gives advice and says, in this case, Ahithophel's advice is not right. He said, you know my father and his men, how they're mighty men, and they're fierce, like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. And your father is an expert in warfare and will not spend the night with the people. Behold, he's now hidden himself in one of the caves or in another place. And it'll be when he falls on them at the first attack that whoever hears of it will say, there's been a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom. And even the one who is valiant, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will completely lose heart. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and those who are with him are valiant men. I don't know that you can beat him with 12,000 men. What you need to do is wait. And you need to get all of Israel's power consolidated, and then you need to cross the Jordan. And you need to go fight him in a city in which he has to defend, and in doing so, you'll be able to defeat him. And in this particular case, the Lord confounds the advice of Ahithophel, and Absalom goes along with what Hushai had said rather than Ahithophel. And Hushai then sends word to David through the avenue that I have described to you earlier, so that David will know exactly what's going to happen. And says, that's what we'll do. Now, in the process of doing this, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, who are the spies that are down at En Rogel, are found out, and they have to flee to David. And they go to a woman down there who is close to the Jordan, and she has a well, and she puts them down in the well and puts a covering over it and puts grain over it so that no one will know. And when they're searching for these men who are spies for David, they're not able to find them. And it says they then crossed the brook of water, and when they searched and could not find them, they returned to Jerusalem. And it came about that they departed, that they came out to the well and went and told King David and said, arise and cross over the water quickly, for this Ahithophel has counseled against you. Then David and all the people who were with him arose and crossed the Jordan, and by dawn not even one of them remained who had not crossed the Jordan. When Ahithophel finds out that his advice has not been followed, he goes, gets his house in order, and he says he strangled himself. I expect he probably hanged himself in some way. And he died and was buried in the grave of his father. David then comes to Mahanaim. You remember that had been the old capital where during the Civil War, Ishbosheth had his capital in Gilead, east of the Jordan River. And David makes that temporarily his capital. And instead of Joab, we see Absalom taking Amasa, his cousin, and putting him in charge of the men of the army in Joab's place. And David then comes to there, and it describes men who came to be with him, especially those who came and brought, as it says, mentions several of them. Mentions Shobi, the son of Nahash from Rabbah of the sons of Ammon, Machir, the son of Amiel from Lodebar, and Barzillai the Gileadite from Rogelim. And they brought beds, basins, pottery, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, lentils, parched seeds, honey, curd, sheep, and cheese of the herd for David and for the people who were with him to eat. For they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. In chapter 18, we see the advantage that happened because of Hushai's advice. David is fortified in Mahanaim, and the people don't want him to get out of Mahanaim. They want him to stay safe there. But David takes his army and divides it into three groups, one under Joab, one under Abishai, and one under Ittai the Gittite, and they fight against Absalom, and Absalom is defeated. And it tells us in verse 7 of chapter 18 that 20,000 men were killed in that day. And the battle was spread over the whole country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. I'm not exactly sure how that happened. I would imagine people getting lost in the forest. Especially, I want you to imagine we're talking about primarily a desert people. And a forest is something that's kind of scary to them. I remember there's some distant relatives of mine who live in Georgia. And I was talking to one of the old timers who's long dead now, but when I was a young man, he said, yeah, I remember some of the kinfolks from Texas who would have been some of my people, said they came to visit us one time in Georgia, and we have these tall pine trees here in Georgia that the wind would blow, and as they came to the farm on the wagon, they were terrified that those trees were going to fall on them. That's not the way Texans think about tall trees necessarily, especially in East Texas. But it's a situation in which desert people think differently about a forest than forest people. And here it tells us how the forest probably confused the men who were trying to fight against David. So it says Absalom in verse 9 happened to meet the servants of David, for Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, so he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him kept going. And a certain man saw it and told Joab and said, behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. And Joab said, now behold, you saw him. Why did you not strike him there in the ground? And I'd have given you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. I guess that would have been a good reward. But the man says, remember, I remember what David said, how that we're not to hurt Absalom. And that would have been violation of what the king said to do. So Absalom asks for someone to give him 3 spears. They go to the place where Absalom is hanging in the tree by his hair. And it says that they came to there where the oak was, and he thrust him through with the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. And then 10 young men who carried Joab's armor gathered around and struck Absalom and killed him. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained the people. And he took Absalom and cast him into a deep pit in the forest, and erected over him a very great heap of stones, and all Israel fled, each to his tent. Now, it tells then about the pillar of Absalom, the monument that he had erected that was in the King's Valley, which may be the Valley of the Kidron. There's a monument in Jerusalem today that is usually called Absalom's monument. It's not likely the same one, and it probably didn't have anything to do with Absalom. But there is a monument there that's generally called that, but just probably miscalled that way. When the word comes that Absalom has been killed, they want them to send word for it. Ahimaaz, you remember, the son of Zadok wants to run and tell David about it. Joab says no, it needs to be the Cushite who does this. And so they both take off running. The Cushite gets a head start, but Ahimaaz winds up beating him. And Ahimaaz gets there first. And when he does, he says, now David was sitting between the 2 gates in verse 24. And the watchman went up on the roof to the gate by the wall and raised his eyes and looked. And behold, a man was running by himself. And the watchman called and told the king. And the king said, is he by himself? There's a good news in his mouth. And he came nearer and nearer. And the watchman saw another man running. And the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, behold, another man running by himself. And the king said, this one also is bringing good news. And the watchman said, I think the running of the first one is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. Can you imagine? I wouldn't know. If I saw any of y'all running out there, I wouldn't be able to tell the way you ran. These people must have been familiar with how each other ran, because he says he's running just like, who was it? I guess it was Ahimaaz that he's running like. And so the king said, this is a good man, and he comes with good news. So Ahimaaz came and said, all is well. And the king is glad about that, but he says, how's the young man Absalom? And Ahimaaz hesitates. And about that time, the Cushite gets there. And when he arrived, he says, this is verse 31, let my lord the king receive good news, for the Lord has freed you from this day from the hand of all those who rose up against you. Then the king said to the Cushite, is it well with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite answered, let the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be as this young man. What's he telling him? He's dead, and I hope all your enemies are just as dead. And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And thus he said as he walked, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. That's about all the time that we have for tonight. We're still a couple of chapters behind, but I'd like you to read chapter 21. If you've not read through chapter 20, please do that. But read chapter 21 through chapter 1 of 1 Kings. So if you'll do that, you'll be well prepared for next time. Thank you very much. Appreciate your kind attention.